my name is Auke and I'd like to welcome you to this special virtual tour of the South African Astronomical Observatory. Our tour guide will be Professor Ian Glass, or as he likes to call himself,
Dr. Glass, Professor Glass, all sorts of things.
And because of the pandemic, I'll be asking him questions virtually and he'll actually be answering them. But before we go on our walkabout on site to show you these amazing telescopes and things, I'd like to give you an overview of what the entire complex looks like. As the oldest observatory in the southern hemisphere, and in fact observatory celebrated its 200th birthday just last month, various buildings have come and gone over time. I've shown them on this aerial photo with black outlines, but they're a bit difficult to see, so let's take the photo away for a moment to see its history a bit better. This site has always been more than just a place of work. It's literally home to some people who live on site. The buildings shown in green here are homes. That large blue building is a workshop. The purple ones are admin, and the red ones are the special ones. That's where the telescopes live. We'll be visiting these places today, and that's our route. And we'll be starting with the oldest structure on site, the main building. Oh look, our tour guide is on time. I asked Ian to give me some background on how the observatory came about.
This site we're visiting today is the site of the former Royal Observatory, which is now the headquarters of the South African Astronomical Observatory. It was chosen by the first of Her Majesty's astronomers as a place that could be seen from ships in Table Bay, so they could, for example, receive time signals of some kind to set their chronometers. It was quite a barren site. There were no trees in those days. Everything of that kind was added by the astronomers later. This site was chosen in about the year 1822, and the observatory was constructed in 1825 to 1828. This is one of the first photographs taken in South Africa from 1842 vintage by Piazzi Smyth, who was the chief assistant at that time. It's special because it's probably the first photograph of an observatory, and it's also one of the first photographs taken in South Africa. During the building phase, unfortunately, there was a budget cutback, so a few little details like access roads and fences and toilets were left out. So the astronomers had to make shift for a few years until they got the money to set these things right. In the middle, we see the McClean telescope of about 1896. And to the left of that is the wind tower, which is much older, about 1840 vintage. And to the left of that is the Astrographic Telescope from about 1890. You see in front of the wind tower there's another dome, and that's the Stevenson, which was here for a very brief period and subsequently went overseas and ended its life in Spain, where it still is.
After going downstairs, we went to the east wing.
This is the room where the Airy telescope was originally installed, and you can see the shutters, or what we call chasers. The walls opened along the meridian so that you could see all the way from north to south. This is the transit circle of 1855 vintage, what we call the Airy transit circle. It was in the main building until about 1950.
I asked Ian what happened to it.
Well, you see, in 1950, the Airy telescope was demolished and scrapped, and you can see that the pillars were removed. That's why there's a big hole in the floor in this picture. The room now has been converted to be a kind of operations centre for the telescopes at Sutherland, which is where most of the astronomy is done now. In the distance, you can see the SAAO telescope, South African Large Telescope. It's about 11 meters diameter, and it's one of the largest telescopes in the world. On the right, we see the 74-inch telescope, which is in a sort of, how to describe it? We called it, it used to be called the cake house when it was in Pretoria, because it's shaped like a cake.
From the east wing, we popped across to the west wing, which is now a spacious reading room, and took a look at the Hardy regulator, and then it was time to hit the road. Our next stop, the beautiful McClean Dome. En route, we passed an unusual runoff roof building known as the Lyot.
It was one of a set of similar telescopes around the world, sponsored by the International Geophysical Year, and it took a picture of the sun, I think, every 2 minutes on film. Now, this building, which we call the 1896 building, that was started as a battery house in connection with the McClean telescope next to it. Now, McClean was a British amateur who had had some success as a visitor to the Cape, in fact, in determining the presence of oxygen in stars. So he was quite a well-known person, even amongst astronomers. This shows the McClean telescope probably quite soon after it was completed. And this front door was never actually used in practice. We normally go through the back door. The floor is a hydraulically operated one, and you can adjust it to the most convenient height for using the telescope. This is the McClean telescope that was donated by Frank McClean to Gill for purposes of doing astrophysics, which was what Gill really wanted to do, but which the Navy wouldn't finance for him. This telescope consists of, actually at the moment, 4 separate telescopes all on the same mount. The biggest one is a 24-inch photographically corrected telescope. The next one is an 18-inch visual telescope, and then we have a guide telescope, 8 inches diameter, and you see on the side a later edition, which is called the old astrometric camera. The telescope and optics were made by Grubb in Dublin. Grubb was actually a very successful optician, and he gave a lecture to the Royal Institution about his optical techniques. This telescope was originally intended for spectroscopy, and that's what it did for most of the first 30 years about. But after that it was converted to photographic plates, and it was used for parallax determination mostly. I think it was last used for research around about 1980, maybe a little bit later than that, and it was for parallax work mainly.
First floor haberdashery, children.
It was very soon after the McClean was built, they decided to add a laboratory to it. The idea being that you could do spectroscopy with the telescope and compare it to spectroscopy done in the lab on various elements and other materials, so that you could compare the spectra of earthly materials with what you saw through the spectrograph on the stars. Basically, the interest in spectroscopy declined, or at least in trying to identify new lines and so on, and it wasn't used for very much until I came along in the 1970s, and I needed a place to do infrared work. And you see what it looked like during the 70s and 80s with all the infrared equipment around. Yes, for a certain period we got a new technical building, as it was called, so this lab became empty, and I proposed that we should convert it into a museum to save all the little bits and pieces that were lying around in drawers and basements and attics and things. And of course a lot of pieces were disappearing, people were taking home souvenirs, so the idea was to make a museum of instruments that were still around. Some of the interesting items in the museum include this objective prism, which went over the 24-inch photographic refractor of the McClean. This is a 6-inch Dalmai rapid rectilinear lens that was used for making the Cape Photographic Dirk Musteren catalogue. You can see it's quite a simple construction. There's 2 achromatic lenses face to face. This is a specular metal mirror made by William Herschel around 1810 and purchased second-hand by the observatory when it got started around 1820. And I found this particular mirror in the basement of the laboratory a few years ago and pulled it out and saved it. This mirror was made by John Herschel, but was brought out by him as one of the several ones that he used at the Cape in the 1830s and hasn't been repolished since. It was sent back to the observatory from England around about 1906. This is the Holland repeating transit, dating from about 1820, one of the first instruments used at the observatory. This is where the wind tower would have stood until about the middle 1960s. The big dome on the left is the McClean, but in the foreground there's a photographic dome that doesn't exist anymore, and behind that the wind tower, which was also a photographic dome in its latter days. Now you can just about see the telescope peeping out at the top of the picture. The dome was built by Grab for the occasion around about 1880, and that's what it looked like inside when it had the first photographic telescope in there. Gill had decided to make a photographic survey of the southern sky. It was a pioneering survey because nobody had really done this before, and so he bought a special lens and he attached it to his wooden tube, which had a plate holder at the bottom, and mounted the whole thing on an existing mount that could track the stars. This is the 6-inch telescope that was used for random observations of the sky, such as comets, and was used to mount the early photographic camera on. In 1882, a very bright comet appeared and was discovered by one of the astronomers, Finlay, and just after that, an amateur in the Eastern Cape took a photograph with an ordinary camera, but this camera actually showed some stars in the background. So Gill realized he now had a method of photographing the sky, and that this was the logical way to make star catalogues from now on. Before Gill saw these early pictures, he didn't realize that you could actually photograph stars quite successfully. And that was because photographic plates have become much more sensitive in the last few years before we're talking about. One of the later uses of this telescope was by Willem de Sitter, the famous Dutch cosmologist who came here as a student. He was doing Zollner photometry using this telescope around about the early 1890s. Next to the 6-inch telescope is the Astrographic or Carte du Ciel telescope of 13 inches diameter, made by Grab. McClean installed an objective prism in the front of the telescope, and that caused images such as you see on the right, in which you got the spectra of all the individual stars in the field of view. And using this system, he actually discovered oxygen for the first time in stars. This is the focus end of the Astrographic Telescope, and you see a couple of other small cameras mounted on the side at this particular time. The mounting was last used for a Newtonian 16-inch by a Japanese graduate student, and since that time the dome has simply been a storeroom. The original telescope is lying at the side of the dome on the floor, and the lenses are stored in a cupboard nearby.
Leaving the Astrographic, we've now completed our tour of the southern part of the site, and we're heading over to behind the main building to visit the 18-inch telescope first. Here we see the venerable astronomer paying homage to his ancestors in the hope of eternal life.
This mount originally carried an 8-inch Repsol heliometer, an instrument for measuring close double stars. The heliometer was dismounted and it was in a storeroom for many years, and it disappeared, and we suspect it was stolen and melted down. Well, the mount had in the meantime been converted for use, first of all with the 7-inch Merz telescope, and then later on with the reflector, the 18-inch reflector made by Cox, Hargreaves and Thomson about 1955. Some of the world's best photometry at the time was done using this telescope, and the 7-inch was used as a guide telescope for this one. After leaving the 18-inch, I walked past the technical building, which is where modern instruments are made for use at Sutherland. We see the dome of the solar telescope in the distance. That was built in 1848, originally to house the Merz telescope when it was independently mounted equatorially. Next to it was the battery house used to contain DC voltage supplies, probably to illuminate the eyepieces of the Merz telescope, which in those days also had a double star micrometer on it. The dome here is very interesting. It moves on cannonballs. It's very hard to move at the moment, probably because it hasn't been used much recently. Because of the lockdown, a lot of dirt has accumulated, dust. Domes are not airtight, so unfortunately a lot of dust has accumulated on the telescope. The original Merz mounting was considered too flimsy by Gill, by Stone actually, one of the HM astronomers, and he purchased this Troughton and Sims mount as a much more rigid mount to put the 7-inch on. But somewhere later, around about 1910 or 1915, that was replaced with the solar telescope that you see here. The solar telescope itself dated from even also around about the 1870s and had been mounted on a separate mounting by Dallmayr. This is an image of the sun cast on a ground glass screen at the end of the tube. Originally, photographic plates would have been mounted here.
After closing up the old dome, we made our way around the back of the auditorium, which used to be a workshop, and headed for our final stop.
Our next destination is the Reversible Transit Circle, or RTC. That was designed by Gill and finished around about 1905. This is what it looks like today. It's rusting away, but we have some nice pictures of how it looked in the good old days.
As we were exploring inside this rather odd dome, I asked Ian what's the historical significance of the RTC.
Well, this was one of the most accurate transit circles ever built. In fact, it was copied by other people later. But of course, now that we've had satellites like Hipparcos and Gaia, these type of measurements are for the most part obsolete.
From what he told me, it's perhaps important to note that the RTC we see here today is not the way Gill left it early in the 20th century.
Yes, in later years, the whole setup was upgraded to have photographic recording of the declination readings by means of a number of cameras spaced around the declination circle.
And with that, dear friends, colleagues, and those of ambiguous allegiance, our virtual tour has come to an end. When? Not if you visit Cape Town, post-pandemic of course. Do get in touch, either with myself, if you want the 5-cent tour, or otherwise with
Dr. Glass, Professor Glass, all sorts of things.
And we'll show you these cool things in person, as well as all the secret things we couldn't show you.